Enter the world of Sherlock mysteries, where reason conquers riddles. Kindly like and subscribe to Sherlock Mysteries. Which part of the world are you watching from? The curtain rises. Chapter: Ai Fei, the lady in distress. It was upon an evening of persistent drizzle, when the lamps of Baker Street burned with a halo of mist about their glass, and the passing hansoms rattled like muffled drums upon the wet cobbles, that Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb first presented herself at our door. I had been seated opposite Holmes, engaged in the indolent perusal of a medical monograph, while my friend reclined in his customary attitude, long limbs disposed in seeming carelessness, though his grey eyes betrayed an alertness that no posture could conceal. The fire glowed low in the grate, casting restless shadows upon the walls, when there came a hurried footfall upon the stairs and a knock at our sitting-room door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a lady clad in deep mourning silk, her veil drawn back, but her countenance pale beneath the lamplight. She possessed that air of cultivated restraint common among the upper circles of society, yet the agitation of her gloved hands, which twisted together at her waist, betrayed an inward tumult that no training could wholly suppress. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she began, her voice steady by an evident effort of will. Holmes rose and bowed slightly. "At your service, madam. Pray be seated. Dr. Watson is my colleague and confidant. You may speak freely before him." She inclined her head in acknowledgement and seated herself upon the edge of the chair, as though fearing that any relaxation might dissolve the composure she so carefully maintained. "My name is Eleanor Whitcomb," she said. "I reside at Blackthorn Hall near Woking. I come to you because my husband, Mr. Henry Adrian Whitcomb, died 3 nights ago under circumstances so inexplicable that I can no longer rest in silence." Holmes's fingers came together, the tips touching lightly. His expression was one of quiet attention, neither encouraging nor discouraging, but wholly receptive. "You believe," he said gently, "that the circumstances of your husband's death were not as they appeared." "I do not merely believe it," she returned, her eyes flashing for the first time. "I know it." There was a silence broken only by the hiss of rain against the window pane. "Pray proceed," Holmes murmured. She drew a breath. "On the evening of the 24th, my husband and I dined alone. The servants had withdrawn early, as was customary, save for our butler, Mr. Ames, who remained in the hall. My husband excused himself shortly after 9 o'clock, stating that he intended to consult certain papers in the West Study. Though christened Henry Adrian, he was most often called Henry within the family. Was this his habit?" Holmes interjected. "Yes, the study was his private domain. None of the servants entered it without express permission." Holmes nodded for her to continue. "I remained in the drawing room for perhaps 5 minutes," she said. "It was then that I recalled a letter I had meant to show him. I left the room and passed along the central corridor. As I approached the west wing, I observed my husband enter the study. I saw him distinctly." "In what manner?" Holmes asked. She seemed momentarily perplexed. "In what manner, sir? Did you see him directly, or by reflection? Consider carefully." A faint crease appeared between her brows. "There is a large mirror in the hallway," she said slowly. "It stands opposite the study door. I saw his figure in that mirror as he turned the handle and entered." Holmes's eyelids drooped by the smallest fraction, a sign known well to me of heightened interest. "You are certain it was not his reflection departing the room?" "Quite certain. He was facing away from me, moving toward the study. I saw the back of him, his dark coat, the slight stoop of his shoulders. He closed the door behind him." "And you heard no sound?" "None. The house was perfectly still." Holmes inclined his head. "What followed?" "I went directly to the study door and knocked. There was no reply. I assumed he had not yet settled and returned to the drawing room. Some minutes later, no more than 10, I heard a scream. Her composure faltered. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips before continuing. She had gone to the conservatory at the far end of the east wing to close the shutters. She found my husband lying upon the tiled floor. "The conservatory!" I exclaimed, unable to restrain myself. "But you had just seen him enter the West Study." "That is precisely the horror of it," she said. The conservatory lies at the opposite extremity of the house. Even at a brisk pace, it would require several minutes to traverse the distance. Yet he lay there, dead. Holmes's voice was very quiet. In what condition was the body discovered? He was upon his back. There was a single wound upon his temple. The physician declared it to be the result of a fall, perhaps against the marble edge of a fountain which stands at the center of the conservatory. Was there blood? Yes, a small quantity. And signs of struggle? None. Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed. You have spoken of servants. Did any encounter your husband after he entered the study? Mr. Ames was in the hall and swears he saw no one pass toward the east wing. The maids were in the kitchen. The footman had retired. And the windows? All secured. Holmes rose abruptly and paced to the hearth. His long shadow stretched across the carpet. You are confident, he said, that the interval between your sighting of your husband and the discovery of his body did not exceed 10 minutes. I am certain of it. And during that interval you heard nothing, no footstep, no cry, nothing. Holmes turned. Mrs. Whitcomb, you said that you saw your husband in the mirror. Tell me, was the corridor brightly lit? There were 2 gas lamps. Behind you, or before you? Behind me, she answered after a moment's thought. They are fixed along the central wall. And the study door, was it open when you first observed him? It was ajar. Holmes resumed his seat. The hallway mirror, he said thoughtfully. Describe it. It is tall, nearly to the ceiling, an old Venetian piece. My husband prized it greatly. Has it been moved of late? She looked startled. Moved? Number or polished? Reframed? Not to my knowledge. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me, a glance that conveyed more than words. The mirror had fixed his attention as firmly as a magnet draws steel. Madam, he said at last, what was your husband's disposition in the days preceding his death? She hesitated. He was preoccupied. There had been financial matters, investments of uncertain outcome, yet he was not a man given to despair. If you suggest suicide, I cannot accept it. Holmes lifted a hand. I suggest nothing. I merely collect impressions. She rose slightly in her seat, leaning forward. Mr. Holmes, I know what I saw. My husband entered that study. He could not have reached the conservatory in the time allotted. There was no passage, no hidden stair, and yet he lay there as though transported. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It is as if the house itself betrayed him. Holmes's expression softened, not with sentiment, but with concentration sharpened to its finest edge. Blackthorn Hall, he repeated. A structure of what age? 17th century, with additions in the last 50 years. A house of passages and renovations, Holmes murmured. He rose and stood before her. Mrs. Whitcomb, I shall require permission to examine the premises at once. Dr. Watson will accompany me. Relief flooded her features. You shall have it, sir. This very night, if you wish. Holmes glanced toward the window, where the rain traced erratic patterns upon the glass. Tomorrow morning will suffice, he said. There is little profit in disturbing dust before one can see it. She extended her hand, which Holmes bowed over with old-fashioned courtesy. As she departed, the echo of her steps descending the stairs lingered faintly. For some moments, Holmes remained motionless. Then he crossed swiftly to the mantel and lit his pipe. Well, Holmes? I ventured. He exhaled a thin stream of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. My dear Watson, he said, we are presented with a problem of spatial impossibility, always a dangerous phrase. When a man appears to traverse an insurmountable distance in insufficient time, there are but 3 explanations. Which are first, that our perception of time is erroneous. Second, that our perception of distance is flawed. Third, he paused, the faintest smile touching his lips, that our perception itself has been artfully deceived. You suspect the mirror. I suspect nothing, he replied lightly, but I observe that our client's certainty rests entirely upon what she saw reflected in that glass. Remove or distort the reflection, and the impossibility dissolves. You mean she might have mistaken someone else for her husband? Or mistaken movement for direction, or direction for movement? His eyes gleamed. Mirrors are faithful servants, Watson, but they are also obedient to geometry. He tapped the ash from his pipe. The hallway mirror outside the study door, he murmured. There lies the fulcrum upon which this mystery will turn. Outside, the rain continued its steady descent, as though washing London of its lesser sins. Yet I felt, as I often did at the commencement of one of Holmes's singular investigations, that beneath the surface of ordinary events there stirred a darker current, silent, deliberate, and waiting to be revealed. Chapter Teseke, the Hall of Doubt, Blackthorn Hall, stood upon a gentle rise beyond the village of Woking. Its darkened gables cutting a severe outline against the pale winter sky. Though portions of the house bore the ornamentation of more recent decades, its heart was ancient, 17th century stone, over which ivy clung like a persistent memory. The rain of the previous evening had given way to a thin, colorless sunlight that lent the estate an air of stark clarity, as though it had been set beneath a lens for examination. Holmes and I were received at the great oak doors by Mr. Ames, the butler, a spare, dignified man whose impassive countenance suggested either exceptional discipline or the exhaustion of grief. His voice, when he addressed us, was low and measured. "Mrs. Whitcomb awaits you in the morning room, gentlemen." Holmes inclined his head. "We shall first require a view of the corridor in question." A flicker of surprise passed over the butler's features. "The corridor, sir?" "Yes, the corridor." Without further inquiry, Ames led us through the entrance hall and into the central passage of the house. It was as Mrs. Whitcomb had described, long, narrow, and uncommonly straight, extending from the western wing toward the conservatory in the east. The polished floorboards ran unbroken beneath our feet, and along the walls hung portraits of Whitcomb ancestors, whose painted gazes followed one with austere disapproval. Midway down this architectural spine stood the west study door, dark oak, brass, handled, and at present firmly shut. Opposite it, mounted upon the wall with deliberate symmetry, was the mirror. It was an imposing piece, nearly 7 feet in height, framed in elaborate gilt, carved with cherubic figures and curling vines. Its glass, though aged, retained a remarkable clarity. It captured the entire length of the corridor in its reflection, compressing distance into a luminous rectangle. Holmes halted before it. He did not at once approach. Instead, he stood some 10 feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the mirror's reflection rather than its surface. I had seen that posture before. It was the attitude of a duelist measuring his opponent. "Watson," he murmured, "stand at the base of the staircase." The staircase rose from the corridor's western end in a gentle curve. I complied, taking position upon the second step, as Mrs. Whitcomb had described her vantage. "Now," Holmes continued, "inform me when you perceive me to enter the study." He moved slowly along the passage. I saw him directly at first, his tall figure unmistakable. Then, as he passed beyond the angle of my sight, I saw him only in the mirror, his reflection diminishing and altering perspective as he advanced. "Proceed," I called. He paused before the study door. From my position, the mirror showed him turned slightly toward it. Yet the image possessed an odd ambiguity. The narrowing of the corridor in reflection lent the illusion that he stood nearer the conservatory than in truth he did. Holmes opened the study door and stepped just inside, allowing it to remain ajar. "Well?" he asked from within. "I saw you enter," I replied. "Precisely as Mrs. Whitcomb described." "Indeed." He re-emerged and closed the door softly. "Ames," he said, turning abruptly to the butler, "at what hour was this mirror last cleaned?" The man hesitated. "It is dusted daily, sir." "You're moved from its mounting?" "No, sir." Holmes stepped forward at last and examined the frame closely. His fingers traced the gilt edges. He pressed lightly at its sides, then at the base where it met the wall. I observed that his gaze was not confined to the glass itself, but strayed frequently to the narrow strip of plaster surrounding it. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the proportions." I joined him. "The mirror is wide enough to reflect the entire corridor. he continued. Yet its placement is curious. It is mounted not directly opposite the center of the passage, but slightly angled, by perhaps 3 degrees. He produced from his pocket a small measuring instrument, a folding rule, and a slender plumb line, tools as familiar to him as a surgeon's scalpel to me. After a brief calculation, he nodded. 3 degrees and a fraction. Is that significant? I asked. Significant. He smiled faintly. It is deliberate. Mrs. Whitcomb approached from the morning room, her expression anxious. Mr. Holmes, you wish to see the conservatory. The body was found there. In due course, madam. First, indulge me. He positioned himself midway between the staircase and the study door. Pray resume your place upon the stairs as on the night in question. She complied, her hands gripping the banister. Now, Holmes said, imagine your husband standing not at the study door, but some yards farther along the corridor. He moved toward the east wing beyond the study, until he stood nearly opposite a narrow side passage I had not previously noticed. Observe me in the mirror. Mrs. Whitcomb looked, her breath caught audibly. It appears, she whispered, as though you stand nearer the study than you do. Just so, Holmes replied. From my position, I perceived the effect clearly. The slight angling of the mirror altered the apparent alignment of the corridor. A man standing several yards beyond the study might, to an observer at the staircase, appear to be turning into it. Holmes's eyes shone with quiet triumph. A corridor, he repeated softly, may indeed be shortened by deception. Mrs. Whitcomb descended the steps slowly. Are you suggesting, she said, her voice strained, that my husband never entered the study at all? I suggest only that what you witnessed was a reflection subject to geometric manipulation. He crossed to the wall beside the mirror and examined a faint line in the plaster. So faint I would not have remarked it unaided. Watson, he said, note the outline here. There was, I saw, the ghost of a previous mounting, a rectangular discoloration slightly lower and more centered than the present position. This mirror, Holmes continued, has been shifted. Ames stiffened. Shifted, sir, impossible. It has hung there for years. Holmes regarded him keenly. Not so many years as you suppose. The butler faltered, then recovered. If it has been moved, it was by Mr. Whitcomb's direction. Mrs. Whitcomb turned sharply. Henry never mentioned such a thing. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he strode toward the eastern extremity of the corridor, where the conservatory doors stood closed behind heavy velvet drapes. He drew them aside. The conservatory was a long chamber of glass and iron, sunlight filtering through its panes to illuminate rows of exotic plants. At its center stood a marble fountain, now dry for the season. Upon its rim, I observed a faint dark stain, no doubt the trace of the fatal wound. Holmes surveyed the tiled floor with meticulous care. He knelt, his magnifying lens glinting as it caught the light. No sign of violent struggle, he murmured. No disturbance among the pots. And yet, he rose and paced slowly back along the corridor, measuring the distance with deliberate steps from the point where Mrs. Whitcomb believed she saw her husband enter the study to this spot. He said, the interval is 57 paces. He turned to us. A healthy man might traverse it in less than a minute. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at him. But I saw him. You saw a figure, Holmes corrected gently. A figure whose position was dictated not by its true location, but by the angle of that glass. The silence that followed was profound. I felt the first tremor of revelation, though its full shape remained indistinct. Holmes, I said, if Mr. Whitcomb never entered the study, where was he bound? Holmes glanced once more toward the mirror, as though acknowledging its subtle mischief. That, he replied, is the question upon which this house now balances. His gaze drifted to the narrow side passage beyond the study, a passage partly obscured by the mirror's gilded edge. Mrs. Whitcomb, he asked quietly, what lies at the end of that corridor? She hesitated. A small door, she said. It leads to the old gardener's quarters. It has not been used in years. Holmes's expression did not alter, yet I sensed in him the quickening of pursuit. "A disused door," he murmured, "and a mirror newly angled." He turned once more to the glass, tilting his head slightly, as if greeting an old adversary whose strategy he had begun at last to decipher. "The Hall of Doubt," he said softly, "is seldom haunted by spirits, Watson. It is haunted by perspective." And with that, he stepped toward the neglected passage, leaving behind him the long, gleaming corridor in which reality and reflection had so deftly exchanged their places. Chapter 3, The Angle of Deceit. Holmes wasted no further time in speculation. From the inner pocket of his traveling coat, he produced a slender measuring tape of steel, together with a small brass inclinometer of the sort employed by surveyors. Kneeling lightly upon one knee before the mirror, he applied the instrument first to the wall, then to the frame itself, making minute adjustments until he appeared satisfied. "What do you observe?" I asked. "That which I anticipated," he replied. "The mirror is angled inward, by a fraction more than a single degree." "To so small an extent?" I exclaimed. "To so decisive an extent," Holmes corrected quietly. He rose and beckoned me toward the staircase once more. "Pray resume your former station, Watson. Mrs. Whitcomb, if you would be so good as to remain here beside me." I ascended to the second step and turned my gaze upon the glass. Holmes positioned himself several yards beyond the study door, in the direction of the eastern wing, where the corridor narrowed subtly before reaching the conservatory. "Now," he called, "observe." From where I stood, the mirror presented his figure as though it occupied the threshold of the study. The deception was astonishing in its simplicity. The corridor's straight lines converged within the frame. The slight inward tilt displaced the reflected vanishing point. A man walking directly toward the conservatory appeared to deviate leftward, precisely where the study lay. "Remarkable," I murmured. Holmes stepped a pace further along the hall. In the glass, he seemed to vanish into the study entirely, though I knew him to be nowhere near its door. Mrs. Whitcomb uttered a low cry. "That is precisely what I saw," she said. "He turned. He must have turned." "He did not turn," Holmes said gently. He continued straight ahead. He returned to the mirror and tapped its gilded frame with a fingernail. "It was not sorcery that misled you, madam, but geometry. A deviation of 1 degree is imperceptible to the casual eye. Yet over the length of this corridor, it produces a displacement of several feet in reflection. The effect is magnified by distance and by expectation." "Expectation," I echoed. Holmes nodded. "You anticipated your husband's entry into the study. The mirror supplied an image that satisfied that anticipation. The mind, once reassured, does not question." Mrs. Whitcomb pressed a hand to her breast. "Then Henry never entered the study at all." "It would appear not." Holmes bent once more to examine the frame. Running a gloved finger along its upper ridge, he held it up for our inspection. Upon the pale kid leather was a faint, dark streak. "The dust here has been recently disturbed," he said. "Note the clean line running obliquely across the accumulation. The mirror has been handled, shifted from its former position." He indicated the faint rectangular ghost upon the plaster, evidence of the earlier mounting we had already observed. "A trivial adjustment," he continued, "requiring no more than a screwdriver and a moment's calculation. Yet it transforms certainty into illusion." Ames, who had remained at a discreet distance, now spoke with measured restraint. "Sir, the mirror has hung thus since before my service." Holmes's eyes flickered toward him. "Your service here commenced when?" "4 years ago, sir." "And Mr. Whitcomb acquired the estate?" 5 years past." Holmes's expression betrayed nothing. "Then we must assume," he said lightly, "that the alteration occurred within that period." Mrs. Whitcomb turned upon the butler. "Mr. Ames, did my husband ever instruct you to move the mirror?" "Not to my knowledge, madam," Holmes interposed smoothly. "We shall not pursue that question at present. Instead, let us consider the consequence." He paced slowly along the corridor, measuring again the distance from the staircase to the conservatory doors. To an observer stationed upon the staircase, however, his reflection, caught and displaced by this angled glass, would suggest the contrary. Then he went toward the conservatory, I asked. Undoubtedly. And why should he do so? Holmes paused before the heavy velvet drapes concealing the conservatory entrance. That, he replied, is the pivot upon which motive must turn. He drew the drapes aside once more, allowing the pale light to spill across the tiled floor. The marble fountain stood silent at the chamber's center, its rim still bearing the faint discoloration where Mr. Whitcomb's head had struck. Holmes approached it thoughtfully. A single wound upon the temple, he mused, pronounced consistent with a fall. He leaned close to the marble edge, examining its contour. The angle of impact, he continued, would require a forward motion, not a collapse from standing still. Meaning, I prompted. Meaning that Mr. Whitcomb was moving when he fell. Perhaps he slipped upon dry tile. Holmes shook his head slightly, and without disturbing a single pot or leaf. No, Watson, a fall may be accidental, but accidents leave untidy signatures. He stepped back and surveyed the room in its entirety. The glass panes admitted a wintry brightness. Beyond them, the grounds lay sodden and still. If he came willingly, Holmes said softly, he came with purpose, and if he came with purpose, he expected to find something, or someone. Mrs. Whitcomb's face had grown pale. You suggest a meeting? Holmes inclined his head. I suggest possibility. He returned once more to the corridor and stood before the mirror. Consider, he said, addressing us both. The mirror's alteration ensures that any observer at the staircase would believe Mr. Whitcomb entered the study. Thus, for a brief interval, he would appear secluded, alone with his papers. No servant would think to seek him elsewhere. No interruption would occur. You mean, I said slowly, that the deception granted privacy? Precisely. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at the glass, as though it had betrayed her personally. But who would conceive such a scheme? Holmes's eyes narrowed. One who understood perspective, one who had measured this corridor, one who knew precisely where an observer would stand. His gaze drifted toward the staircase, then toward the shadowed side passage beyond the study. The narrow corridor leading, as Mrs. Whitcomb had said, to the disused gardener's quarters. A man walking straight down the hall, he repeated. He crossed to the wall beside the mirror and examined the screws securing its frame. They are recently replaced, he observed. The metal bears little corrosion compared with the adjacent fittings. Could your husband have made the alteration himself? I asked Mrs. Whitcomb. She shook her head slowly. Henry detested manual labor. He would have summoned a workman. Holmes's lips curved faintly. And yet no record of such a workman exists, I presume. None. He turned to me. The angle of deceit, Watson, is not merely optical. It is temporal. By diverting perception for a span of minutes, the perpetrator ensured that Mr. Whitcomb's true destination remained unsuspected. And that destination, I said, glancing toward the conservatory, was here. Holmes nodded once, for reasons we have yet to uncover. A silence descended upon us, heavy with implication. The corridor, with its ancestral portraits and polished floor, seemed less a passageway than a calculated instrument, each line and surface enlisted in a subtle conspiracy. Holmes removed his gloves and folded them carefully. Mrs. Whitcomb, he said, did your husband receive any visitor that evening? Number, any letter, any message delivered privately? She hesitated. There was a note, she admitted at last. It arrived by post that afternoon. Henry read it in his study before dinner. I did not see its contents. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Is it preserved? I cannot say. Then we shall search for it. He cast one final look at the mirror. A single degree, he murmured, almost to himself. A minute shift, imperceptible, yet decisive. It is always the smallest angles, Watson, that divert the straightest paths. And as we stood in that silent corridor, its length compressed and distorted within the gilt frame, I felt with growing certainty that the true crime at Blackthorn Hall had not been the blow that ended Henry Whitcomb's life, but the calculation that preceded it. Chapter Forfait, the body in the conservatory. It is one of the lesser mercies of my association with Sherlock Holmes that I have been compelled, time and again, to look steadily upon the material facts of death until the mind, in sheer self-defense, learns to consider them as problems rather than horrors. Yet, I confess that when the velvet drapes were drawn back and the conservatory lay revealed before us, its iron ribs arched like the skeleton of some vast creature and its panes filmed with the damp breath of winter, I felt again that old tightening at the throat, which no habit ever wholly conquers. The chamber was long and bright in a cold, indifferent fashion. The light fell through high glass in pale bands upon the tiled floor, striking here upon broad fern fronds, there upon the glossy leaves of camellias, and again upon the delicate lattice of orchids which hung in airy profusion near the eastern wall. The marble fountain at the center, dry for the season, stood like an altar to a forgotten god. And there, within a few feet of the fountain's rim, lay the master of the house. Mrs. Whitcomb's trembling voice, lingering over his still form, gave the distinction of names a new and painful weight. Henry. Adrian, she whispered, as though the double name had become unbearable in death. His Christian names were Henry Adrian. His father insisted that the second be used in formal life, for it was the name of an uncle who left him the greater part of his fortune. Holmes, who never wasted an instant on anything irrelevant to the case, merely inclined his head. "Then we shall call him Mr. Whitcomb," he said quietly, and stepped forward. The corpse lay partly upon its side, one arm flung out. The fingers relaxed as if the final gesture had been an unfinished inquiry. His expression, if I may use such a word of the dead, was fixed in mild astonishment rather than terror. The mouth was slightly parted, the eyes half open, unseeing but not distorted. There was no contortion of agony. What struck me immediately, however, was the disorder about him. Several orchid pots lay shattered, their earthenware fragments scattered among dark spills of soil. A few pale blossoms had been crushed into the tiles, their petals smeared as though dragged by a careless foot. Yet beyond this small radius, the conservatory seemed strangely undisturbed. There were no overturned chairs, no broken trellis work, no evidence of a struggle which might have carried across the room. Holmes stopped short of the body and remained motionless for several seconds, his gaze sweeping the chamber in that rapid, all-embracing manner which was so characteristic of him. Then he removed his gloves with fastidious care, folded them, and placed them in his pocket, as though preparing for a delicate operation. "Ames," he said without turning, "draw those curtains wider. I want the fullest light." The butler obeyed. The pale sun brightened, and with it every detail became more uncompromising. Holmes crouched beside the body, not touching it at first. He studied the man's clothing, the fall of the coat, the crumple of the waistcoat, the set of the boots. Then, with the tip of a finger, he lifted back a strand of hair from the right temple. The wound was small, clean, edged, and situated a little above the ear. There was blood, but not in any great quantity. No broad spatter, no smeared evidence of a hand raised defensively. "One decisive blow," Holmes murmured, "and delivered from close quarters." I knelt beside him, professional instinct overcoming distaste. "There are no defensive injuries," I said. "No bruising on the forearms, no broken nails." Holmes's eyes remained upon the face. "He did not see it coming," he replied. Or if he saw, he did not comprehend. Mrs. Whitcomb, who had stood rigid at the doorway as though held by some invisible restraint, now forced herself a step nearer. "Dr. Watson," she said faintly. "The doctor." "Our physician," said he fell. He said the fountain. Holmes looked up at her with a gentleness that did not lessen his precision. "The local physician was not dishonest, madam," he said. "He was merely hurried. A man may indeed strike his temple upon marble and die, but the question is why he struck it." He rose slightly and examined the rim of the fountain. I had earlier observed a faint stain there. Now Holmes's gaze fixed upon it with greater concentration. He produced his lens and held it close to the marble. "Here's the mark of impact," he said. "A small depression in the surface, fresh enough that the edges have not darkened with age. The angle of the scuff suggests forward motion." "You mean he ran?" I asked. "Not necessarily, but he moved, either stepping toward the fountain or being driven toward it." He shifted his attention to the tiles around the body. It was then that I saw the peculiar thing which had evidently caught his eye from the moment he entered. The patterns in the soil. The shattered pots had spilled earth, yet the earth lay not in a natural scatter, but in faint streaks and arcs, thin sweeps as if a foot had brushed through it. Here and there were crescent-shaped smudges upon the tile, as though something had been dragged lightly over it and lifted again. Holmes's finger hovered a hair's breadth above the markings, never quite touching. "Observe," he said. "Soil does not arrange itself with intention, men do. Are you suggesting this scene has been altered?" "I suggest that someone wished it to appear more chaotic than it was." He shifted to another patch and pointed to a line of darker earth that ran in a narrow track toward the conservatory door. "This is not the random scatter of breakage," he continued. "This is a trail." "From the door to the body," I said. "Or from the body to the door," Holmes corrected. "Direction is everything, Watson." He rose and crossed to the conservatory entrance. The door opened inward, as our client had said, and bore no sign of forced entry. The hinges were sound. The brass handle was polished, and upon its surface, Holmes's eyes lingered for a fraction of a second longer than seemed necessary. He drew a small paper packet from his pocket, a pinch of fine grey powder, and with the delicacy of a chemist dusted the handle. When he held it to the light, a faint smudge became visible. "Grease," he murmured, "and a trace of grit, not from this room." I stared. "From outside? From a gravel path?" "Yes, or from a boot that has crossed one." Mrs. Whitcomb made a small sound of distress. "But the door was locked," she said. "It is always bolted at night." Holmes looked at the bolt and tried it. It slid smoothly. "A bolt may be thrown after the fact," he remarked. He returned to the body and examined the hands. The fingers were clean, the nails bore no soil, the cuffs were unmarked. "A gentleman who has not fallen headlong into dirt," I observed. Holmes's gaze flicked to the broken orchids. "And yet we have broken pots," he said. "Broken where they would break most easily, and in a quantity sufficient to suggest disturbance, yet without the secondary evidence of a struggle." I began to understand. "Staged," I said. Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Staged, either by the murderer or by someone who arrived first and panicked." Mrs. Whitcomb's face was white. "No one arrived first," she whispered. "The maid screamed. The butler ran. I ran. You ran from where?" Holmes asked suddenly. From the swiftness of the question, I knew he had been waiting for it. "From the drawing room," she said. "I was there when the scream came." "How long after you saw your husband, Mr. Whitcomb, enter what you believe to be the study?" 10 minutes, she said. And then, with desperate certainty, no more. Holmes crossed to the mantel at the far end of the conservatory. A small clock stood there, beneath a glass dome, its brass face gleaming. He leaned close to it. "The timepiece has stopped," he observed. Mrs. Whitcomb pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "It stopped when he fell." The doctor said the shock. Holmes lifted the dome and examined the clock more carefully. "It did not stop from shock," he said calmly. "Its spring is intact. It was stopped by a finger placed here, upon the minute hand." He pointed to the faintest smear upon the brass. "A deliberate stoppage," I said, startled. "A deliberate stoppage meant to fix an interval," Holmes replied. "Note the time, 9 minutes past 9. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes widened. "That is the precise span which would make your sighting upon the staircase and the discovery here seem impossibly close." Holmes finished. "It is a convenient coincidence. Too convenient." Ames, who had stood silent, now spoke, his voice thick. "Sir, are you accusing someone of tampering with the clock?" Holmes turned his cool gaze upon him. "I accuse no one yet. I merely observe that someone wished the time of death to be within minutes of the supposed sighting." He replaced the dome gently. "Which means," I said slowly, "that Mrs. Whitcomb did not witness her husband's final movement at all." Holmes' eyes met mine precisely. "She witnessed an illusion of direction created by the mirror. After that, all timings can be made to appear miraculous." Mrs. Whitcomb swayed. I stepped forward instinctively, but she steadied herself against the doorframe. "Then he walked down this corridor," she said in a whisper. "He came here. Someone met him. Someone struck him." Holmes knelt again, this time at the side of the body's coat. He slipped 2 fingers into the inner pocket and withdrew them empty. "No note," he remarked. Mrs. Whitcomb's voice was strained. "The letter. We shall return to the study presently," Holmes said. "But before we do, let us make clear what we have." He gestured, as if arranging facts upon an invisible table. Mr. Whitcomb was summoned to the conservatory. He arrived unsuspecting. He was struck once, decisively, by a person close enough to ensure accuracy and confident enough that no second blow would be required. He did not raise his hands in defense, therefore he trusted the man who stood before him. The words fell into the cold air with a weight that seemed to settle upon every leaf and pane. "You say man." I noted. Holmes's mouth tightened slightly. A useful generality. The force required for such a blow, delivered so cleanly, is more consistent with a man's arm. But there are women who could do it, and men who could not. We shall not be lazy, Watson. He rose and walked to the shattered orchid pots, with the care of one handling fragile evidence. He lifted a fragment of earthenware and held it to the light. "This fracture is fresh," he said. But the pot did not break by being knocked from its hook. It was struck, perhaps with a boot, after it was already on the floor. "How can you tell?" Holmes indicated the inner rim, where a small crescent of glaze had been chipped away. "A direct blow leaves a clean notch. A fall leaves irregular shattering. Someone wished to scatter soil and fragments. Why? To create confusion, but confusion for whom? For the servants, I ventured. For Mrs. Whitcomb. For anyone who might later examine the tiles, Holmes corrected. A trail of soil can be made to imply the direction a man moved, or the path a second man took in leaving. He set the fragment down and stood very still, listening. In the conservatory, sound carried strangely. The faintest creak from the corridor became a clear whisper. Somewhere in the house a door closed softly. A bird fluttered against the glass and was still. Holmes turned his head toward the east wall. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I listened. At first there was only silence. Then, faint as a breath, came a rhythmic tick. Tick, like the contraction of a mechanism. "A clock," I said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Not that clock," he replied, glancing at the stopped mantelpiece timepiece. "Something else. Something that continues to measure while another has been forcibly silenced." He moved toward the far corner where the orchids hung thickest, and there, partly concealed behind foliage, I saw a small brass apparatus fixed to the iron framework. A horticultural regulator, perhaps, or some manner of winding mechanism. Holmes examined it, then smiled faintly. "A timer," he said, "for the heating vents, set to release warm air at intervals." He tapped it lightly. "This one has been recently rewound." "What of it?" I asked. "It tells me that someone has been attending to details in this room. Details a casual visitor would ignore. Someone comfortable here." He turned back to Mrs. Whitcomb. "Who besides your husband took an interest in the conservatory?" She hesitated. "Mr. Whitcomb loved his orchids. She said he employed a gardener once, years ago. Since then, the head gardener oversees the grounds, but the conservatory, Henry preferred to manage it himself." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "No one else. No friend, no guest, no relative, at the word relative." A change came over her, so slight that only one who watched as Holmes watched would have caught it. Her eyes flickered away for an instant. Her fingers tightened upon the handkerchief. Holmes noted it, as I noted it, but neither of us spoke. He moved to the conservatory door again and examined the threshold closely. There were faint scuff marks there, almost invisible unless one knelt. Holmes knelt. He ran his thumb along the groove and sniffed it, a habit which never ceased to amuse and astonish me. "Soap," he murmured. "Summoners washed this threshold recently." "Washed," I repeated. "To remove traces," he said. "Footprint, soil, anything that might tell a story against them. He stood and looked down once more upon the dead man. A single blow, he said, almost thoughtfully. A trusted summons. A mirror adjusted by a degree. A clock stopped by a finger. A threshold washed, and orchids broken afterward to muddy the tale. He straightened, his eyes now cold with purpose. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "we shall go now to the study." She drew a shuddering breath. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, if there is anything there." Holmes's voice softened, but his meaning did not. "There is always something," he said. "The only question is whether we arrive in time to read it before someone else attempts to rewrite it." As we left the conservatory, I cast one last glance back at the body sprawled among the pale, crushed blossoms. In that frozen astonishment, I fancied I could read the same question that was tightening like a noose about all of us. Who, in the apparent safety of Blackthorn Hall, could have summoned a man to his death and arranged the very architecture to conceal the path he took to meet it? Chapter V. The helpful cousin. We returned along the corridor, with the conservatory's chill still clinging to our coats, and I found that the long spine of Blackthorn Hall wore a different character now that Holmes had exposed its trick of perspective. What had seemed merely an architectural convenience, the straight passage, the balanced doors, the proud Venetian mirror, had become, in my imagination, an instrument, measured, adjusted, and employed with the cold efficiency of a mechanical trap. Mrs. Whitcomb led the way toward the west study, her steps controlled yet hurried, as though fear pressed at her shoulders. Holmes followed at a pace that seemed almost leisurely, but the slight forward inclination of his head and the steadiness of his eyes upon every surface told me that his mind moved much faster than his feet. At the threshold of the study she paused, hesitating as if the very brass handle might burn her fingers. "The key is in my husband's desk," she said. "He kept it there always." Holmes's brows rose. "And yet you were able to knock upon the door that evening. Was it locked then?" "It was not," she admitted, a flush rising beneath her pallor. "Henry, Mr. Whitcomb, often left it unlatched when he expected to return quickly." "Convenient," Holmes murmured, not as accusation, but as observation. She opened the door. The west study was a room in the older style, high shelves laden with leather, bound volumes, an oak writing table scarred by decades of use, and heavy curtains drawn half across the tall windows. A coal fire burned low, throwing a warm, steady light that stood in striking contrast to the cold brilliance of the conservatory. Holmes walked directly to the desk and ran his fingertips lightly over its surface, as if reading history in the grain. He opened a drawer without asking, inspected its contents, and shut it again. He did the same with the next, Watson. I was about to comment upon the impropriety, but Mrs. Whitcomb had already given permission in the loosened, desperate way of the bereaved. "This is his key," she said, producing it from a small compartment. "And this was the letter he received." She held out an envelope. Holmes did not snatch it. He took it with care, holding it by the edges, and examined first the paper, then the seal, then the faint indentations upon its surface. "No stamp," he observed. "It was hand-delivered," she said. "Then someone entered your grounds, placed a note into your domestic machinery, and departed without troubling the post office." Holmes's eyes flicked up. "Does that strike you as usual?" "No," she whispered. Holmes turned the envelope over. The address was written in an elegant, unhurried hand. "Mr. Whitcomb, Blackthorn Hall. No return." He slid a thin blade beneath the flap, opened it, and withdrew a single sheet. His eyes moved over it once, only once, before he folded it again. "Watson," he said casually, as though speaking of the weather, "our field of suspects has just narrowed." Before I could press him, the door behind us opened, and a voice smoothly modulated filled the room. "My dear Eleanor, you should not trouble yourself with these matters so soon. Grief is a delicate thing." We turned. A gentleman stood in the doorway, hat in hand. He was perhaps 40, lean almost to angularity, and dressed with the restrained care of a man who wishes to appear soberly respectable, while ensuring that no seam betrays him. His hair was dark and neatly trimmed, his moustache similarly disciplined. The most notable feature, however, were his eyes, sharp, light-colored, and restless in a way that did not accord with the sympathetic softness of his voice. Mrs. Whitcomb stiffened. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "this is my cousin, Mr. Harold Bennett." Holmes bowed with polite indifference. "Mr. Bennett." Bennett stepped forward, offering a hand. "A pleasure, Mr. Holmes, I had hoped, though under better circumstances, that I might meet the man of whom London speaks so often." Holmes took his hand with a grip that was firm without being warm. I saw, as Bennett withdrew, the slight tightening at the corner of Holmes's mouth, which meant that he had already registered much from that single contact. The dryness of the skin, the stiffness of the joints, the faint odor of tobacco or spirit that lingers even upon a careful man. Bennett's gaze shifted quickly from Holmes to me, weighing and dismissing in an instant. "And you, sir, Dr. Watson," I said. "Ah, yes." His smile broadened. "The famous doctor. How fortunate you are, Eleanor, to have secured such assistance." Mrs. Whitcomb did not respond to the compliment. Her fingers were still clenched about her handkerchief. Bennett continued, his tone light. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, I am relieved you have come. The local constable is a worthy man, but hardly suited to, well, to mysteries." Holmes' eyes drifted, as if by accident, to the mantel clock, to the books, to the corner where a walking stick rested. Yet his voice was perfectly courteous. "We shall do what we can." Bennett drew a chair and sat with the ease of one who assumes his right to occupy any room. "You will find," he said, "that we have all been terribly shaken. Poor Adrian, Henry within the family, of course, was never meant for such an end. He was a man of intellect, if not always of prudence." Holmes's eyelids drooped faintly. "You were closely connected to his affairs?" he asked. Bennett waved a hand. "Only as family must be. When rumors reached me that the estate was under strain, I came down to offer assistance. Blackthorn is not merely a house, it is a responsibility. Adrian, Henry, he would have plunged us all into embarrassment if he continued unchecked." Mrs. Whitcomb spoke at last, her voice sharp. "He was not a gambler." Bennett's smile remained in place, but its edges hardened. No, my dear, not in the vulgar sense, but investments, speculation, modern ventures. One hears such things in London." Holmes said nothing, yet I felt his attention settle upon Bennett as a hawk settles upon a moving leaf. "And you arrived," Holmes said. "Weeks ago. 3 weeks, perhaps 4. Bennett's eyes flicked to the window, then back. Time blurs in a country house. "And during those weeks," Holmes continued, "you concerned yourself with the house's arrangement." Bennett chuckled. "I have a fondness for practical improvements. A country estate must not become a museum. Certain things were inconvenient, old-fashioned, the corridor, for example." Holmes turned his head slightly. "The corridor," he repeated. "Yes, dim, narrow, rather oppressive. Eleanor complained once that it felt like a tunnel." Bennett leaned forward confidentially. "So I suggested we modernize it, shift a few pieces, brighten it. The mirror, particularly, was badly placed. It did not catch the light well. It made the space feel shorter than it was." Holmes's gaze remained mild. "And so you altered it." Bennett spread his hands. "Modest. Only by a little. We moved it up and slightly, so that it would reflect the corridor properly. I supervised the work myself. One must ensure that servants do not damage antiques." Mrs. Whitcomb stared at him as though she saw him anew. "You never told me," she said quietly. Bennett's smile wavered at last. "My dear Eleanor, I had no wish to burden you with trifles." Holmes's voice was soft. "Which servants assisted in the moving?" Bennett's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. 2 footmen. They are gone now, dismissed yesterday in the confusion. Ames can confirm." Holmes nodded once, as if the matter were of no consequence. Yet I knew he had stored the detail like a needle in velvet. Bennett continued, undeterred. It is absurd, of course, to imagine that the mirror has any bearing upon what occurred. A tragic accident. Surely, Adrian was always prone to headaches, dizzy spells. He might easily. Holmes lifted a hand. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "you have mentioned improvement twice." Bennett's smile returned, though more cautiously. "I am a man who dislikes stagnation." Holmes regarded him with that curious blend of courtesy and penetration, which made men feel both at ease and exposed. Why improve what required no improvement? He asked. The question was delivered with the lightness of idle conversation, yet it struck the room like the tap of a hammer upon glass. For an instant Bennett did not answer. His smile remained, but it did not reach his eyes. Those eyes, always alert, darted toward Mrs. Whitcomb, then toward the desk, then back to Holmes, as though seeking, in the arrangement of objects, some hidden advantage. "Well," he said at last, with a small laugh, "is it not the way of progress? One does not wait for decay before one strengthens." Holmes's expression did not change. "Indeed," he said. "And where were you during the critical minutes, between Mrs. Whitcomb's sighting and the scream from the conservatory?" Bennett's posture relaxed, as if pleased to answer something practical. "In the smoking room," he said. "Alone. I had taken a brandy after dinner. I read the Times. I heard the scream and came at once." Holmes nodded. "No servant saw you there." Bennett's eyes flashed, quick irritation disguised as amusement. "I hardly require witnesses to my solitude." "Quite," Holmes said. He turned away, as though the conversation had ended, and began to examine the shelves, his gaze roaming over titles without any obvious purpose. Bennett rose, smoothing his cuffs. "If there is anything I may do," he said, "I am at your disposal. We must see justice done, if justice is required." Holmes looked over his shoulder. "Your assistance may indeed be required," he said pleasantly. "In the meantime, I would ask only that you do not leave the estate." Bennett's smile held, but a faint tension tightened his jaw. "I had no intention of leaving," he replied. When he had gone, Mrs. Whitcomb remained standing, her face stricken by a new uncertainty. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "Harold is difficult, but he is family. He came to help." Holmes placed the folded note upon the desk with a care that seemed almost reverent. "Help, madam," he said, "is a word that requires definition. I could not restrain myself. You suspect him." Holmes's eyes remained upon the door through which Bennett had departed. "I suspect everyone," he said quietly, "until their facts absolve them." He tapped the note once with his finger. "And Mr. Bennett has provided facts, only not of the sort he intended." "What do you mean?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. He moved to the window, drew the curtain aside a few inches, and looked out toward the grounds where the gravel paths glistened with moisture. "Consider," he said softly. A mirror moved under his supervision, a claim of solitude unconfirmed, an eagerness to call the death an accident, a tone of progress when what was altered served not comfort, but deception. He turned back to us, his face composed. "Watson," he said, "we have found our first truly useful character." "Useful," I echoed. Holmes's smile was thin. "Yes," he said, "because a man who is helpful in precisely the right places is often the man who has arranged the places to require help." Mrs. Whitcomb sank into the nearest chair, her eyes fixed upon the desk where the mysterious note lay folded. "And the letter," she whispered. "What did it say?" Holmes's gaze grew very still. "It asked your husband to meet someone in the conservatory at 9 o'clock, he said. It promised him relief from his financial troubles." Mrs. Whitcomb's hand flew to her mouth. "And it was signed." Holmes's voice lowered. "It was unsigned," he replied. "But it was written by a person who knows how men like Mr. Whitcomb think and how houses like Blackthorn Hall can be made to lie." He placed his hand upon the back of my chair. "Come, Watson," he said. "We shall visit the smoking room. A man may claim to have been alone, but the air of a room remembers what a mouth has breathed." And as we left the study, I glanced once more toward the corridor and that tall gilt frame, which now seemed less an ornament than an accomplice. An accomplice introduced to us, with careful manners and eyes too alert for comfort, by the very man who called himself helpful. Chapter the Sea. A passage invented Holmes did not at once lead us to the smoking room, as he had promised in that quiet, ominous manner of his. Instead, he returned with deliberate purpose to the central corridor, back to the long, narrow spine of Blackthorn Hall, where portraits watched in mute judgment, and every polished board seemed to await the next footfall with expectant patience. "There is no use," he remarked, "in questioning a man until one has first established the shape of his lie." Bennett, who had been summoned by Mrs. Whitcomb at Holmes's request, arrived within minutes. He came with an air of well-bred irritation carefully leashed beneath politeness, like a dog restrained by a silk ribbon. "You wish to see me again?" he asked. "Surely, Mr. Holmes. You do not mean to keep the household in rehearsal as though we were actors in a farce?" Holmes smiled faintly. "There are few places where a farce and a tragedy are so easily mistaken. Mr. Bennett, pray indulge us." Mrs. Whitcomb stood at the base of the staircase, pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. Holmes approached her with a gentleness which, though rare in him, never felt theatrical. "Madam," he said, "I must ask you to do again what you did on that evening. Take your position upon the stairs. Look as you looked then." She obeyed without a word and mounted to the second step, her eyes fixed upon the mirror opposite the study, as if it were a thing alive and capable of turning its face away. Holmes turned to Bennett. "Walk down the corridor at a natural pace," he said. "Do not glance at the study. Walk as one whose destination lies beyond it." Bennett's brows rose. "To what end?" "To the end of truth," Holmes replied. Bennett gave a slight shrug, as if humoring a child, and began to walk. I watched him directly at first, noting the precise placement of his boots upon the boards, the straightness of his back, the almost studied care with which he moved. Then he passed beyond Mrs. Whitcomb's direct line of sight, and she saw him only in the mirror. A small sound escaped her throat. He is turning," she whispered. "He is going into the study." From her vantage, Bennett's reflected figure did indeed appear to deviate leftward and disappear into the study door, though in truth, he continued straight along the corridor toward the east wing. Holmes held up a hand, and Bennett halted where he stood, some yards beyond the study. "Remain there," Holmes said. He turned to Mrs. Whitcomb. "Madam, would you swear upon your honor that you have just seen Mr. Bennett enter the study?" She clutched the banister. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "I would have sworn it," Holmes nodded gravely. "Thank you." He crossed to the mirror and examined it once more, with that air of intimate appraisal one might give to a clever adversary. Then, without any flourish, he produced from his pocket a small screwdriver and loosened the upper screws which held the gilt frame to its bracket. Bennett shifted where he stood. "Mr. Holmes," he said sharply, "surely you are not dismantling property in a house already?" "I am correcting it," Holmes replied calmly. With infinitesimal care, he adjusted the mirror outward. Not enough that a casual eye would register movement, but enough that a keen one might notice the slight change in the way the corridor's light fell upon its surface. He tightened the screws again, straightened, and stepped back. "Now," he said, "repeat the experiment." Bennett's jaw tightened, but he complied. He returned to the staircase end and once more walked along the corridor, past the study, toward the conservatory. Mrs. Whitcomb leaned forward, eyes wide, and this time there was no illusion. In the mirror she saw precisely what occurred. Bennett walked straight, unwavering toward the distant drapes of the conservatory door. The study lay untouched at his left, its threshold uncrossed. A gasp, half sob, half cry escaped her. Her fingers slid along the banister as though it had suddenly become unfamiliar beneath her touch. "My God," she whispered. It was only. I was certain. Holmes's voice came softer than I had heard it for some time. You never saw your husband enter the study, he said gently. You saw a reflection constructed to deceive. Mrs. Whitcomb's shoulders shook once, as if the last defense of certainty had broken within her. All this time, she murmured, I have been misled. Holmes turned slightly, ensuring Bennett could hear every word. The mind, he said, builds its memories upon the foundations of perception. When perception is altered, memory becomes a house built upon sand. He walked to the staircase and stood below Mrs. Whitcomb, meeting her eyes. You were not foolish, he said. You were made a witness to a passage that never occurred. Her face was drained of color. Who would do such a thing? She asked. Who would? Use the hallway itself. Holmes' gaze drifted past her, down the corridor, to the mirror now sitting in its truer alignment. The hallway, he said, has become an accomplice, its mirror an architect of false memory. Behind him, Bennett let out a short, incredulous laugh. This is melodrama, he said. A trick of light and angles, nothing more. What has it to do with Adrian's death? Holmes did not turn at once. When he did, his expression was mild, but there was iron beneath it. It has everything to do with it, he replied, because it demonstrates intent. Intent, Bennett repeated, his smile tight. Are you suggesting that because a mirror was shifted, someone must therefore be a murderer? Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. I suggest that someone wished Mrs. Whitcomb to believe her husband secluded himself in the study, that someone wished to grant a span of minutes in which Mr. Whitcomb's true direction toward the conservatory would be unremarked, that someone wished the house itself to provide an alibi of ignorance. He took a step closer, and such care is not taken by accident. Bennett's eyes flashed. You are accusing me. I am demonstrating, Holmes corrected. Accusations come later, when facts have finished speaking. He turned away from Bennett as though dismissing him entirely, and addressed Mrs. Whitcomb again. Madam, you said there was a side passage beyond the study leading to the old gardener's quarters. Yes, she whispered, still shaken. It has not been used for years. Holmes nodded. Not used openly, he said. He walked past the study door and halted before the narrow passage. It was half in shadow, its entrance subtle enough that the eye might miss it if distracted by the glitter of the mirror. At its end stood a plain, unpolished door. Holmes knelt and examined the floorboards at the entrance. There, he said quietly. I stepped closer and saw what he had seen. Faint marks upon the boards, scratches and scuffs that ran in parallel, like the traces of something heavy dragged repeatedly across the same path. A trunk, I suggested. Or a piece of furniture, Holmes replied. Something moved often enough to leave memory in wood. He rose and tried the door. It was locked. Ames, Holmes called. The butler appeared, grave and silent. Who holds the key? Ames hesitated. Mr. Whitcomb held it once, but after the renovations, Mr. Bennett requested that certain old rooms be secured. He keeps the key now. All eyes turned to Bennett. For the first time since we had met him, his composure faltered. It was not a dramatic collapse, only a slight tightening about the mouth, a brief paling at the temples. But to Holmes, who fed upon such minutiae as other men feed upon bread, it was as loud as a shout. Bennett recovered quickly, producing a key from his pocket. It is merely prudent, he said. Old wings breed damp rats. There is no sense in leaving them open. Holmes held out his hand. Bennett placed the key upon Holmes's palm, his fingers lingering a fraction too long, as though reluctant to surrender control of what lay beyond. Holmes inserted it into the lock and turned. The door opened with a soft click. A stale breath of air drifted out, smelling of earth and old wood, as though the house exhaled a secret it had held too long. Holmes did not step inside at once. He stood at the threshold, listening. Not to sound, but to that subtler thing, the feeling of concealed space. A passage invented, he murmured. Mrs. Whitcomb stared into the darkness. I did not know, she whispered. No, Holmes said softly. You were not meant to. He turned back to Bennett, whose face had settled again into its careful mask. Mr. Bennett, Holmes said. When you modernized this hall, did you ever wonder what it might conceal as well as reveal? Holmes's gaze was steady. I see patterns, he replied, and patterns, once seen, are difficult to unsee. He stepped into the narrow passage, and I followed, feeling the temperature drop as we left the warmed corridor behind. Mrs. Whitcomb lingered at the entrance, as if afraid that crossing this threshold might make her complicit in whatever it contained. Behind us, Bennett stood very still. In that stillness, I sensed not innocence, but calculation, an intellect measuring the next move in a game whose board Holmes had begun, at last, to illuminate. The mirror behind us caught the corridor in perfect, honest alignment now. Yet even as it reflected truth, I could not help but feel that the house, having once been taught to lie, might never again be entirely trustworthy. Chapter 7 Fey motive in the ledger. The narrow passage yielded little at first glance beyond dust and disuse. It led to a small antechamber that had once, perhaps, served the gardener of earlier generations. A plain table, a wooden settle, shelves bearing empty jars. No sign of recent habitation presented itself beyond the faintest scuff upon the floorboards near the door. Holmes noted it, but did not linger. Not yet, he murmured, as though speaking to the house itself. Instead, he returned us to the west study. There are crimes, he said, as he closed the study door behind us, which are born of passion, and there are crimes which are born of arithmetic. We must determine which stands before us. He seated himself at Mr. Whitcomb's desk and drew the ledgers toward him with methodical precision. The volumes were thick, their spines cracked from frequent consultation. Ink entries marched in tidy columns across the pages, figures, annotations, corrections. Holmes opened the most recent ledger and ran his long forefinger down a page of sums. "Watson," he said, "you will observe that Mr. Whitcomb was not ruined, but he was exposed." I peered over his shoulder. Certain investments, railway ventures, colonial enterprises, were marked with marginal notes in a firmer, darker ink. Some bore a small cross beside them. "Speculative losses," I said. "Temporary losses," Holmes corrected. "But enough to alarm a cautious man." He turned several pages back. "Here, 3 months ago, he liquidates a holding. Here, 6 weeks ago, he secures a private loan. And here, 10 days before his death, he consults his solicitor." Mrs. Whitcomb, who had seated herself by the fire, looked up sharply. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Hadley came from London. They were closeted here for an hour. And you were not present." "Number," Henry said it concerned. "Technical adjustments." Holmes closed the ledger and reached for a slim leather folder tucked beneath it. "This," he said quietly, "is not an account book." He opened it. Inside lay several folded documents bearing the solicitor's seal. Holmes scanned them with swift, intent eyes. After a moment, he looked up. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said gently, "you are aware that your husband altered his will." Her face went very still. "He mentioned adjustments," she said slowly, "but not details." Holmes held the document lightly between thumb and forefinger. "In its prior form," he said, "Mr. Harold Bennett stood as secondary beneficiary in the event of your husband's death without issue." Mrs. Whitcomb's lips parted. "And now," Holmes said, "Mr. Bennett is removed." The words seemed to fall into the room like a dropped weight. Mrs. Whitcomb rose halfway from her chair. "Removed," she whispered. Holmes inclined his head. "In his place, provision is made for the liquidation of certain assets to satisfy debts. The remainder is settled entirely upon you." For several seconds she could not speak. "He knew," she breathed at last. "Harold knew of this." Holmes folded the will with care. "He learned of it," he said, 3 days before Mr. Whitcomb's death." "How can you know that?" I asked. Holmes tapped the ledger. "Because Mr. Whitcomb noted here, see this entry, discussion with HB unsatisfactory. The date corresponds precisely to the day after the solicitor's visit." And further, he reached into the desk drawer and produced a smaller notebook, its pages filled with brief, almost cryptic memoranda. Your husband was not a man to leave his thoughts unrecorded. Holmes continued. Here, up furious, claims injustice, threatens withdrawal of support. Mrs. Whitcomb pressed a hand to her throat. Support, she repeated. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Mr. Bennet's assistance with estate matters was not purely altruistic, he said. He had access to funds, temporary advances, perhaps. Once removed from the will, that access would soon vanish. A man who expects to inherit may extend credit to himself with remarkable confidence. A man who learns he will not inherit must reconsider. And he confronted Henry, she asked faintly. I think it inevitable. Holmes leaned back in the chair, his fingers steepled exactly as they had been. The evening Mrs. Whitcomb first entered Baker Street. Picture the situation, he said quietly. A cousin, recently arrived under the guise of assistance. Financial strain whispered in the background, a will revised, a future abruptly altered. He rose and paced before the hearth. Mr. Bennet learns of the change. He realizes that whatever temporary influence he holds over the estate is precarious. He confronts his cousin. Words are exchanged. Heated words, I asked. Holmes nodded. The letter summoned Mr. Whitcomb there at 9 o'clock. It promised relief, perhaps a new arrangement, a reconciliation, an alternative scheme. Mr. Whitcomb, anxious and hopeful, goes at once. Mrs. Whitcomb's face tightened. And I believed he went to his study. Holmes's expression softened, but only slightly. The angled mirror provided the necessary alibi, he said. So long as you believed your husband had entered the study, time itself stood as Mr. Bennet's defense. He turned to me. Consider, Watson. If Mrs. Whitcomb sees her husband enter the study at precisely 9 o'clock, and at 9 minutes past 9, he is discovered dead in the conservatory, what conclusion follows? That he could not have traversed the distance in that interval, I replied. That something inexplicable occurred. Precisely, the illusion of impossibility diverts inquiry. It transforms a simple meeting into a puzzle of distance and time. While minds struggle with the mechanics, motive sleeps undisturbed. Mrs. Whitcomb sank back into her chair. He lured him, she said hoarsely. Harold lured him. Holmes did not answer directly. He moved to the desk again and lifted the unsigned letter we had examined earlier. The handwriting, he said, is disguised. The strokes are deliberate, rounded, overly cautious, but the pressure upon the downstrokes betrays habit. He placed the letter beside a document from the ledger, a memorandum signed by Bennet. See here, he said to me, the downward thrust of the pen upon certain letters, the slight rightward slant when the writer grows impatient. A man may alter his script, he rarely alters his rhythm. You believe Bennet wrote it. I believe Bennet intended that it should not be traced to him. That in itself is eloquent. A heavy silence filled the room. But the blow, I said, the wound upon the temple, was it deliberate? Or did the confrontation turn sudden? Holmes's eyes grew distant, as if replaying an unseen scene. Mr. Whitcomb arrives in the conservatory, he said slowly. He expects discussion, perhaps argument, but not violence. Bennet stands close enough to speak confidentially. The fountain at his side provides both prop and weapon. He strikes him, I murmured. One decisive blow, Holmes said. No defensive wounds, no cry heard in the corridor. And then Mrs. Whitcomb whispered. Then comes calculation, Holmes replied. He crossed to the window and looked out over the gravel path. The body falls. Bennet realizes that the confrontation has passed beyond recall. Panic does not suit such a man. He prefers order. He adjusts the scene, breaks orchid pots to simulate disturbance, smears soil to confuse direction, washes the threshold. And the clock, I added. Yes. He stops the clock at 9 minutes past 9, just enough to compress the timeline. The earlier Mrs. Whitcomb believes she saw her husband enter the study, the more impossible the interval appears. Holmes turned back to us. And all the while, he said. "He relies upon one simple truth, that no one questions what they think they have seen." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes filled. But she did not weep. There was something harder than grief now in her expression. Something approaching clarity. "He stood in this room," she said slowly. "He spoke of progress, of improvement. All the while he had already..." Her voice failed. Holmes inclined his head. "Motive lies not only in greed," he said. "It lies in wounded pride, in thwarted expectation, in the humiliation of exclusion. To be removed from a will is to be told, in ink, that one is no longer trusted." "And yet," I said, uneasy, "we have no witness to the blow. No one saw him in the conservatory." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "On the contrary," he said, "we have a witness of a different kind." He tapped the ledger once more. "Motive in the ledger," he repeated. "But proof must be drawn from elsewhere." He folded the will and replaced it carefully. "Watson," he said, "a man who calculates so precisely does not overlook every detail. There will be something, small, perhaps, that betrays him, a trace he did not anticipate, a habit he could not suppress. Madam, you have been deceived by reflection. Now we must discover what Mr. Bennet could not reflect away." As we left the study once more, I felt the case narrowing. Not in breadth, but in focus. The mirror had provided the mechanism. The ledger had revealed the motive. The meeting in the conservatory had ceased to be an enigma of space and time, and had become something more intimate and more terrible. A private reckoning between two men bound by blood and divided by inheritance. And in that reckoning, one had decided that arithmetic must be settled not upon paper, but upon stone. Chapter 7. Dust. As witness, it is a curious thing, and one which Holmes has often remarked upon, that men who pride themselves upon their intellect are most apt to despise the humble evidence of common things. They will argue of motives and alibis as though crime were a chessboard, yet overlook the faintest scuff upon a board, the smallest fiber upon a cuff, the invisible residue upon a finger. To Holmes, however, the world was a ledger written in dust, and if a man imagined he could erase his entry, Holmes would read the smudge where the erasure had been. He returned us, therefore, not to the conservatory, nor to the disused passage, but to that gilt-framed mirror which had so neatly taught an honest woman to misremember her own eyes. "A mirror reflects," he observed quietly, "but it also remembers." Mrs. Whitcomb stood beside the staircase, still pale, as though the corridor itself had become an accusation from which she could not escape. Ames lingered a few paces away, hands folded, his face a butler's mask stretched over deep unease. I noticed that more than one servant hovered at the far end of the hall, drawn by fear and curiosity in equal measure. Holmes, with the air of a man returning to a point of decision, examined the mirror's frame once more. He did not look into the glass. He looked around it, at the plaster, the screws, the narrow ledge at the top, where dust gathered in undisturbed ridges like grey velvet. From his pocket, he produced a small card, plain, stiff paper, and the blade of a penknife. With exquisite delicacy, he ran the knife along the upper ridge of the frame. A fine line of dust slid onto the card in a soft grey curl. He collected it as a chemist might collect a rare powder, then held the card up to the light. "What do you expect to find?" I asked. "The truth of movement," he replied. He turned and moved to the wall itself, just above the mirror's right-hand corner, where the plaster met the frame. There, a narrow strip, no wider than the thickness of my thumb, showed a different character. It was not cleaner, exactly, but different. The dust lay thinner, its texture altered. Holmes scraped gently at this strip and collected a second sample. Then he did something which, though trivial in appearance, struck me as profoundly characteristic. He folded each card, noted a brief mark upon it with his pencil, and placed them side by side upon the mantel table that stood in the corridor. In the pale daylight, the differences became evident even to my less trained eye. The dust from the frame was darker, coarser. It contained minute flecks of black coal dust, soot from the lamps, the inevitable accumulation of a lived in-house. The dust from the wall, however, was paler and finer, containing tiny white particles almost chalk. Like, Holmes tapped the paler sample with his fingernail. Plaster, he said. He tapped the darker. Coal dust and household soot. He straightened and turned to Ames. You polish this mirror daily, you said. Yes, sir, Ames replied carefully. It is among the duties. With a cloth. Yes, sir. And does the cloth ever touch the top ridge of the frame? Ames hesitated. Not ordinarily, sir. It is high. One dusts it occasionally with a feather brush. Holmes nodded. Then this ridge, he said, indicating the clean streak we had seen earlier, would not be disturbed by routine polishing. It would be disturbed only by handling. He moved his finger along the upper edge again, tracing that faint line where dust had been swept aside. This, he continued, is the mark of pressure. Hands gripping here, lifting, shifting. Note how the dust is not simply wiped away. It is pushed into a narrow ridge at the side. That is the signature of movement, not cleaning. Mrs. Whitcomb's voice was faint. When was it moved? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he knelt and examined the screws. He loosened one slightly, then tightened it again, testing the bite of the metal. These screws were set recently, he murmured. Their threads are clean. He stood and turned to the servants gathered at the far end of the corridor. I require, he said, the testimony of anyone who attended the hall on the morning of the 24th. There was a murmur. A maid stepped forward, one of the younger ones, cheeks flushed with fear. I dusted the portrait, sir, she said. And Mr. Bennet, he was here. Holmes's eyes fixed upon her kindly, encouraging. At what hour? After breakfast, sir, before the post came. And what did Mr. Bennet do? The girl swallowed. He had a cloth, she said. He was polishing the mirror. He told me to leave it, that he would do it himself because it was valuable. Holmes glanced at Ames. I was present, the butler admitted reluctantly. Mr. Bennet insisted. He said he did not trust the footman not to scratch it. Holmes's expression remained placid, but I saw the quickening in his eyes. And did he polish it upon the surface only? Holmes asked. Ames's gaze flickered. He stood upon a chair, sir. He seemed to dust along the top. Mrs. Whitcomb's hand flew to her mouth. He never told me, she whispered again. But now the phrase carried a different meaning, less betrayal than dawning comprehension. Holmes returned to his dust samples. Observe, he said to me quietly, dust is the patient witness. It records not what a man says, but what he touches. He held up the two cards. The settled particles along the wall paler containing plaster are older dust, undisturbed. The darker dust from the frame has been displaced, compressed, and partially removed. The boundary between them forms an outline which corresponds exactly to the mirror's former position. He moved to the wall and traced the faint rectangular ghost we had seen earlier. But now, under Holmes's guidance, it appeared far more vivid, a pale silhouette of where the mirror had once rested. This outline, he said, is not months old. It is fresh. If it had been moved weeks ago, the surrounding dust would have settled and softened the contrast. Instead, the edges are sharp. The dust has had little time to accumulate. Then it was moved, on the morning of the crime. Holmes finished. A silence fell over the corridor. The servants exchanged frightened looks. Mrs. Whitcomb swayed slightly. Even Ames's composed mask seemed to tighten. Holmes's voice was very quiet now. The degree of alteration, he said, though minute, required deliberate calculation. One does not happen upon the exact angle that causes a man to appear to turn into a door. It must be measured from the staircase, tested, adjusted. He gestured down the hall. Mark the precision of it. Not 2 degrees, not half a degree, just enough. The work of a man who has stood where Mrs. Whitcomb stood and watched the corridor through the mirror until the illusion satisfied him. I felt a chill, not from the house, but from the cold clarity of the idea. Geometry had become conspiracy, I murmured. Holmes inclined his head. Exactly. Mrs. Whitcomb found her voice at last. Then Harold. he insisted upon polishing it that morning because he needed to adjust it. Holmes did not rush to confirm. He never gave a conclusion more certainty than the facts allowed. Yet his eyes, those merciless grey eyes, held a calm assurance. He engineered it, he said. He did not stumble upon the trick. He made it serve him. Ames cleared his throat, visibly distressed. "Sir," he said, "Mr. Bennet is family. He has been useful. He—" Holmes lifted a hand. "Mr. Ames," he said gently, "a man may be useful as a key is useful to open doors, but keys also lock." He returned his attention to the dust, then to the mirror itself. "A mirror reflects," he repeated softly. "But it also remembers. It remembers the hands that tilt it, the screws that bite, the dust that shifts. And when a man believes he can hide behind reflection, he forgets that even the quietest surfaces keep account." I could see in Mrs. Whitcomb's face the terrible transformation of grief into certainty. She had come to Baker Street clinging to the impossible, to sorcery, to mystery, to anything but the banal horror of betrayal. Now, as Holmes held up a grey card of dust, like a damning affidavit, impossibility fell away, leaving the stark human truth beneath. Holmes replaced the cards carefully into an envelope and sealed it. "Watson," he said, "this will serve." "Serve for what?" I asked. Holmes's mouth tightened. "A man who builds an alibi out of angles must be confronted where his angles fail." He turned, his gaze traveling down the corridor toward the west study, and beyond it to the shadowed passage. "Send word," he said to Ames, "that Mr. Bennet is to join us in the study at once. Tell him it concerns a matter of inheritance." Ames paled, but bowed. "As you wish, sir." As the butler hurried away, the corridor seemed to hold its breath. The portrait stared. The mirror shone with honest alignment now, yet I could not shake the sense that its glass was still complicit. Silent, patient, waiting to reflect the moment, when a man who had trusted geometry as his shield would find himself caught by something far more unforgiving, the simple persistence of dust. Chapter Ife, the breaking of glass. Mr. Harold Bennet entered the west study with outward composure intact, though a closer inspection might have revealed that his step was a fraction too deliberate. His chin held a degree too high. He had the look of a man who believes himself prepared, who has rehearsed indignation and disbelief in equal measure. Holmes stood by the writing desk, the sealed envelope of dust samples resting beside the ledger and the altered will. Mrs. Whitcomb sat rigidly near the hearth, her face pale but resolute. I positioned myself slightly to one side, observing both men. "You sent for me," Bennet said smoothly. "I trust this will not be another theatrical experiment in optics." Holmes inclined his head. "No theater," he replied. "Only arithmetic and dust." Bennet gave a short laugh. "If this is about the mirror again, I assure you." "It is about the mirror," Holmes said calmly, "and about the will." The word hung in the air. Bennet's eyes flickered, only once, toward Mrs. Whitcomb. "I assume," he said lightly, "that you have discovered Adrian's, Henry's, recent adjustments, sensible ones perhaps. A man in debt must be cautious." "Indeed," Holmes said, "particularly when his caution removes a relative from expectation." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Bennet's expression hardened. "If you imply that I resented the alteration, you misunderstand me entirely. I came here to help." Holmes did not raise his voice. "You came here," he said, "because your access to the estate's funds depended upon your proximity to its master. When that proximity was threatened by ink and seal, you sought to renegotiate the future." "Preposterous," Bennet snapped. Holmes lifted the unsigned letter. "This summoned Mr. Whitcomb to the conservatory at 9 o'clock, he said. "It promised relief from his financial strain. It was written in a disguised hand. But the pressure, rhythm, and slant correspond precisely to your own." Bennet's jaw tightened. "You have no proof." Holmes gestured toward the envelope of dust. "On the contrary," he said, "we have proof that the mirror was shifted on the morning of the crime. By your hand, servants testify you insisted upon polishing it personally. The dust upon its frame shows fresh displacement, consistent with adjustment. Not cleaning. I improved it, Bennett retorted. As I have said, why improve what required no improvement? Holmes interrupted softly. The question struck as before, but now there was no audience to charm. Bennett's eyes hardened. You construct fantasies from trifles, he said. Even if I move the mirror, what of it? It proves nothing of murder. Holmes stepped closer. It proves intent, he replied. The angled mirror created the illusion that Mr. Whitcomb entered the study. Mrs. Whitcomb believed it. The household believed it. Thus you gained the minutes you required in the conservatory. Minutes, unobserved. Bennett's voice rose. I was in the smoking room. No servant saw you there, Holmes said evenly, but someone saw you in the conservatory. Bennett's composure flickered. Who? Holmes's eyes dropped briefly to Bennett's sleeve. A witness you carry with you still. All eyes followed his gaze. Upon the dark cuff of Bennett's coat, near the seam clung a faint smudge, brownish, almost invisible, unless one sought it. Bennett instinctively brushed at it. Holmes moved with surprising swiftness and caught his wrist, not violently, but decisively. Do not, he said quietly. He turned the cuff toward the light. Orchid soil, he continued. Not ordinary earth. The conservatory employs an imported blend, peat and crushed bark, mixed with a reddish loam from Surrey. Its composition is distinct. He glanced at me. You noticed its color upon the tiles. Watson. Holmes returned his gaze to Bennett. You washed the threshold, he said. You scattered soil deliberately to obscure footprints, but you overlooked the simplest precaution, the memory of cloth. Bennett's breathing had grown audible. I have walked in the conservatory before, he said. Anion might have. Not today, Holmes replied. The pots were shattered after the blow. The soil upon your cuff bears the moisture of freshly disturbed earth. It has not yet dried to the paler tone of settled dust. He released Bennett's wrist. Mr. Whitcomb arrived, unsuspecting. You confronted him. About the will, about the future you believed. Unjustly denied. Words escalated. You stood near the fountain, one decisive blow. Mrs. Whitcomb closed her eyes. Holmes's voice did not waver. You then arranged the scene. You broke the orchid pots to simulate struggle. You smeared soil to confuse direction. You stopped the clock at 9:09 to compress the timeline, and you trusted the mirror, your mirror, to complete the deception. Bennett's face had drained of color. This is madness, he whispered. Holmes shook his head. Number it is geometry, and greed. For a moment, no one moved. Then Bennett did something wholly unexpected. With a sudden, desperate motion, he stepped backward out of the study and into the corridor. Holmes followed at once, and I after him. The mirror loomed opposite the study door, its gilt frame gleaming with cold dignity. Bennett stood before it, chest heaving. You think this trick condemns me, he cried. It is only glass. In a gesture at once frantic and symbolic, he seized the frame with both hands, as though it might shield him from the words that had stripped him bare. Harold, no, Mrs. Whitcomb cried, but he had already wrenched it forward. The screws, recently tightened yet hastily adjusted earlier by Holmes, gave way under the sudden strain. The great Venetian mirror lurched outward. For a suspended instant it seemed to hang, trembling, reflecting the distorted faces of us all. Holmes calm and unwavering, Mrs. Whitcomb stricken, Bennett wild-eyed. Then it fell. The crash was thunderous. Glass shattered across the marble floor in a cascade of brilliance and ruin. Shards skittered along the boards. The gilded frame split at one corner. The echo reverberated through the corridor like a cannon shot. Servants cried out from distant rooms. Holmes did not flinch. You turned a household ornament into a weapon, he said, his voice carrying cleanly through the ringing aftermath. But even reflections cast shadows. Bennett stared at the wreckage as though he had broken more than glass. For a moment, something in him seemed to collapse inward. The careful manners, the calculated charm, the alert eyes, all dissolved into something raw and desperate. "You cannot prove," he began, but the words faltered. At that instant, heavy footsteps sounded from the entrance hall. Inspector Bradshaw of the Surrey Constabulary, whom Holmes had quietly summoned earlier, under pretext of consultation, entered with two uniformed officers at his side. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Inspector," he said, "you arrive at a convenient moment." Bradshaw surveyed the shattered glass, then Bennett's pale, shaken figure. "Mr. Harold Bennett," he said gravely, "I must ask you to accompany us." Bennett did not resist. The fight had left him with the mirror's fall. As the officers took his arms, not roughly, but firmly, he cast one last look at Mrs. Whitcomb. "I meant only to secure what was mine," he muttered. Holmes's eyes were unyielding. "It was never yours," he said. The officers led Bennett away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor that had once conspired in his defense. Silence followed. The shattered mirror lay in glittering ruin across the marble floor. In its fragments, broken reflections multiplied, distorted faces, splintered ceiling beams, shards of sky. Mrs. Whitcomb stood motionless. "It is finished," she said at last. Holmes regarded the debris thoughtfully. "No," he said softly. "It is explained." He turned to me. "Come, Watson. There remains one final duty, to assemble the whole, that no fragment, however small, be left without its place." And as I looked upon the broken glass, on an architect of false memory, now reduced to glittering testimony, I understood that the true destruction at Blackthorn Hall had not been wrought by the blow in the conservatory, but by the quiet decision to bend reality by a single degree and trust that no one would measure it. Chapter XV Testimony of the Mirror. It was some days after the affair of Blackthorn Hall had reached its inevitable conclusion that the familiar calm of Baker Street resumed its dominion over our lives. The city had reverted to its accustomed rhythm, the soft thunder of omnibuses in the morning, the cries of the newsboys in the afternoon, and at night, the muffled hush of London beneath its veil of smoke and fog. The case itself had already begun to harden, in the public imagination, into a kind of neat anecdote, a mirror murder, as one paper called it with tasteless relish. Yet to me it remained less a curiosity than a lesson carved into the mind. Holmes sat, as he so often did in the intervals between work. In his armchair by the fire, his long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed, as though he were listening to some private melody. The violin lay upon the table, untouched. A thin thread of pipe smoke drifted upward and dissolved into the shadows at the ceiling. Upon the mantel, among Holmes's scattered chemical apparatus and the litter of correspondence that was as much a part of our sitting room as the furniture, lay an object incongruous in our modest quarters, a small rectangular shard of glass, its edge carefully wrapped in paper. It was a fragment of the Venetian mirror. I had watched Holmes collect it himself after Bennett's arrest, selecting the piece with the same measured care one might use in choosing a specimen for a laboratory. The Surrey Constabulary had taken the rest for evidence, of course, but Holmes had requested politely, firmly, that one fragment be entrusted to him for purposes of explanation. Now, it caught the firelight and returned it in a thin, sharp gleam. "You have been thinking of it," I said, breaking a silence that had grown almost companionable. Holmes opened his eyes and regarded the shard without moving his head. "I have been thinking," he replied, "of how little it took." "How little?" I repeated. "A single degree," he said softly. "A slight tilt of glass, a woman's honest eye, and a sequence of events rewritten as neatly as an entry in a ledger." He reached out, and with two fingers, turned the shard so that it reflected a portion of the room. The image was distorted, my own face elongated. The lines of the mantel bent into strange curves, yet it was recognizable. "A mirror," he continued, "does not lie, Watson, in the vulgar sense. It offers precisely what physics demands. But men and women are not instruments. They are interpreters." I recalled Mrs. Whitcomb upon the staircase. The certainty in her voice, the desperation with which she had clung to the impossible rather than accept the banal horror of betrayal. It had been her honesty, in a sense, that made the deception so complete. Mrs. Whitcomb's testimony was honest, I said. She believed it wholly. Exactly, Holmes replied. And therefore it carried the weight of truth. That is what made Bennett's scheme so dangerous. He leaned back, the firelight throwing his sharp profile into relief. The most dangerous lies, he said, are those supported by the eye. I nodded slowly. A jury will always trust what a witness claims to have seen, unless, Holmes said, one teaches them that sight is not knowledge. He lifted the shard once more. The mirror did not merely reflect the corridor, he went on. It invented it. I must confess that the phrase, though simple, sent a small chill through me. It conjured not merely the physical trick of perspective, but the unsettling notion that reality itself might be rearranged by hands clever enough to understand the mind's reliance on appearances. A false passage, I murmured. A false passage, Holmes agreed. Not built of stone, but of assumption. He rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the street lay damp and grey, and a solitary figure passed beneath the gas lamps like a shadow moving through fog. Consider, he said without turning. Mrs. Whitcomb believed she saw her husband enter the study. That belief became the anchor for every subsequent conclusion. When the body appeared in the conservatory, the mind refused to abandon its anchor. Instead, it created an impossibility to preserve the first assumption, and Bennett relied upon that, I said. Holmes nodded. He understood, he replied, that men will wrestle with the mysterious far longer than they will examine the ordinary. Offer them an apparent miracle, and they will stare at the miracle while you slip away through the commonplace. I thought of the clock stopped by a finger, the orchid pots broken after the blow, the threshold washed, the careful insistence upon improvement. All of it had been calculation layered upon calculation, yet all of it had depended upon that first, slight misdirection. The will, I said, the ledger, he was removed as secondary beneficiary. Holmes turned from the window. Arithmetic, he said, the oldest motive and the least romantic. Bennett did not kill from frenzy. He killed to correct a sum that had been altered against him. And yet, I ventured, if he had not moved the mirror, if Mrs. Whitcomb had seen her husband walk toward the conservatory, then the murder would have been exposed to immediate scrutiny. Holmes finished. Servants might have met him. Mrs. Whitcomb might have followed. The constable would have looked first at those who stood nearest to the dead man's final path. Bennett required secrecy, and secrecy required that others look elsewhere. He returned to his chair and seated himself with the air of a man who has completed a demonstration and now permits himself the luxury of reflection. Watson, he said, remember this. When a man claims the impossible, look first for the misdirected truth. The word struck me with the force of a maxim born of experience rather than philosophy. I reached for my notebook, a habit I had fallen into after so many cases, and made a brief jotting. Holmes watched me with a faint amusement. You intend to chronicle it, he observed. I do, I replied, not merely for the public appetite, but for the lesson. Holmes's eyes softened, though only slightly. Mrs. Whitcomb's error was not stupidity, it was humanity. The mind seeks coherence. When coherence is threatened, it prefers wonder to betrayal. I paused, struck by the quiet compassion beneath his detached phrasing. And Bennett, I asked. Holmes's expression hardened again. He will be tried, he said, and convicted. The evidence. Holmes gestured toward the shard upon the mantel. The dust, he said. The servant's testimony that he polished the mirror personally that morning. The unique orchid soil upon his cuff. The altered will, and the ledger entry establishing motive and foreknowledge. The stopped clock and the staged disorder. He gave a slight shrug. A chain, Watson. Every link rational, every link necessary. I could not help but think of the corridor itself, the long spine of the house, and how it had once seemed merely a passage, but had been turned into a device. A Holmes ornament made a murderer's accomplice. And thus, I said softly, The glass became the witness. Holmes reached out and turned the shard one final time. In it, I saw the fire, bent and trembling. My own eye, distorted and yet unmistakably human. And behind it, the dim outline of Holmes himself, steady even in reflection. "Yes," he said, "once a silent accomplice, now the prosecution's most eloquent witness." He set the shard down carefully, as one might lay to rest a dangerous tool. Outside, London continued, indifferent to our conclusions. Yet within our sitting room there was a sense of closure. Not the cheerful closure of a tale neatly finished, but the sober satisfaction of truth recovered from deception. Holmes leaned back, the faintest trace of contentment at the corner of his mouth. "A single degree," he murmured again, and a man imagined he could bend reality. His eyes half closed. "In the end," he added, "reality is stubborn. It leaves dust, it leaves soil, it leaves the mark of a hand where a hand has been." He drew upon his pipe, and the smoke curled upward like a final quiet signature, vanishing into the air, yet leaving behind in the mind an impression no mirror could ever wholly erase.